Okay, I can see a few participants starting to join us. That's good. Welcome to those who are entering the Zoom room. We're just going to wait about a minute to let everyone in. Welcome to those who are here so far. Hopefully people have either hot chocolate or a chocolate bar at hand, given the subject matter of this book. A few more people entering. For those joining us from the United States, it is National Chocolate Day in the US, which is a really good coincidence. Okay, so it is now officially, it's 1 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. We still have a couple more people joining, but just to get us going, welcome to the virtual book launch for chocolate. My name is Anna Delcall. I'm the marketing manager at University of Toronto Press. So before we officially get started, I just want to acknowledge the lands on which the University of Toronto Press operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And today it is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're really grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So to get things started, I'm going to pass it over to Suzanne Rancourt, who's our Manager of Humanities Editorial here at University of Toronto Press, and she's going to introduce our two speakers. Suzanne.
Welcome everyone to this book launch for chocolate. My name is Suzanne Rancourt, and I was the press editor for what was probably my favorite book this year. And I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. Erin Alice Cowling is an associate professor of Spanish at MacEwan University in Edmonton. She studies early modern Spanish plays and is currently working on how modern performance can inform and expand our understanding of the early modern period. Part of that work can be found in the co-edited volume Social Justice in Spanish Golden Age Theatre, which was published by University of Toronto Press earlier this year. Her book Chocolate, How a New World Commodity Conquered Spanish Literature, published earlier this summer. Most recently, she's begun a project in collaboration with Glenda Nieto Cuevas that focuses on how Latinx theater practitioners are adapting and producing early modern Hispanic plays for modern audiences by highlighting and creating awareness of their own reality, lived experiences, and sociocultural background as BIPOC artists. Glenda Nieto Cuevas is an associate professor and George and Louise Peters Professor of World Languages and Literatures at Ohio Wesleyan University. Her courses, publications, and research focus on studying early modern Spanish literature, especially 17th century theater, and its contemporary productions. She's designed and developed numerous high-impact academic projects and works one-on-one with students interested in early modern Spanish theater. Glenda is a co-editor of the volume Social Justice in Spanish Golden Age Theater. I leave it to Erin and Glenda to bring us their thoughts on this book.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for accompanying us today at this book presentation hosted by University of Toronto Press. And especially thanks Anna Delcall, Jenny Kelly, and Suzanne Rancourt for facilitating this visual session. And of course, thank you, Erin, for inviting me to say a few words about your book and for the opportunity to interview you today. And congratulations for this fascinating book. It has been a delight to read it. It is also an honor for me to be here today, and as you know, I greatly admire your work, and I would never pass up the opportunity to talk about chocolate ever. So what is it about chocolate that we can't resist? How did it become part of our daily lives as such as an enjoyable and addictive food? Today, chocolate is, as you all know, consumed as much as coffee, if not more, and often considered a desirable product, especially if it's made in Europe. And this is because we often forget or ignore that its true origins come from the American continent, where it was used by Amerindians as currency, a ceremonial drink or gifts, and even as a health supplement. By writing about chocolate, Cowling opens up a most needed dialogue about the origins of chocolate and value within pre-Columbian cultures and across the Atlantic. How was it consumed and traded by the Amerindians? How chocolate became such a controversial yet acclaimed commodity for the Spaniards? How it rapidly became a favorite treat for the elite? And Cowling's book, titled Chocolate, How a New World Commodity Conquered Spanish Literature, is an interdisciplinary study that answers these and many more questions by analyzing a diverse array of documents and literary sources. And it has been positively reviewed by several specialists of Iberian studies. For example, for William Egginton, this book is a must read for anyone who loves chocolate. On the other hand, Caroline Nadeau asserts that, and I quote, Cowling's fascinating study provides ample evidence of chocolate as status symbol and the fervor that surrounded it throughout the early modern era. And finally, David Castillo said that this book, and I quote, is an intellectual an adventurous journey through uncharted crossroads of political, economic, literary, and culinary histories. In regards to the book's structure, Cowling divided the book into 6 chapters. The first chapter gives us an overview of the importance of chocolate in pre-Columbian cultures prior to the arrival of the Europeans, how it was depicted in different codices as wedding and sacred offerings given in religious ceremonies, or even used as incantations to cure illnesses. Chocolate nonetheless evolved as a controversial food for both sides of the Atlantic, especially for the Spaniards and Europeans. For them, it became a serious topic of debate. In chapter 2, Cowling documents how the Amerindians used chocolate as currency and how the Spaniards tried to understand and value it as a product that could benefit them as well. Moreover, in chapter 3, the author discusses how chocolate enters the European market, making it a new commodity which was at times difficult to find. In chapter 4, she centers on the debate about chocolate as an energy provider, and the following chapter continues the discussion by examining whether chocolate would be detrimental to health and how it should be consumed. Finally, in chapter 6, Cowling explores the presumed magical properties of chocolate, a topic I hope we can go in depth today during this interview. So I prepare a few questions for Cowling that will allow us to start the conversation. Once we're done, we will leave space for all of you, for the audience, to ask questions. So at that time, please use the Q&A tab that you will see below the screen to post your questions. So Erin, so my first question is, at the beginning of your book, you mentioned that the idea of writing about chocolate emerged from writing your dissertation years ago. Could you especially tell us about what prompted you to delve into this topic?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Glenda for that beautiful introduction to the book and also to the University of Toronto Press, especially Suzanne and Anna for setting this up. Suzanne has worked with us for many years now, both on this book for me and the co-edited volume that Glenda and I worked on with several other colleagues, some of which are here today. So thank you for joining us. And thank you. I see so many names that I recognize in the chat, from previous colleagues to current colleagues to people that we work with at the Association for Hispanic Classical Theater. And so it's amazing to see all of you here. Thank you for joining us. So my dissertation was on the Americas and how they were portrayed in early modern Spanish theater. And so as I was writing that piece, I came across a play called Santa Rosa del Peru, which is about the first American saint. And in that play, she takes chocolate as a medicine to cure some stomach pains. Her servant also takes it as a bit of a medicine as well. He's always complaining about how hungry he is because that's what servants complain about. And he also has a toothache, which the chocolate cures. And so I thought this was really fascinating. I had not seen chocolate mentioned anywhere else that I had looked at that point. And so I started to work on that as part of the first chapter, which was on how women, specifically both Spanish women who went to the Americas and Amerindian women, were portrayed in these plays. But it just kind of didn't quite fit with what I was doing with the rest of the dissertation. And so in talking to my advisor, who's William Eggington, we decided not to keep that in the thesis, but I sort of put it aside because I thought this is really interesting and I want to come back to it one day.
Well, thank you. So now let's dig into the content of the book a little bit more. And as you mentioned in your book at the beginning, in the first chapter, chocolate denoted social status in some literary works of the 17th century. However, when talking about the Indianos in the context of specifically Salas Barbadillo, El Sagaz Estacio Marido Examinado, you mentioned that some literary works show that, and I quote from your book, chocolate can be a sign of otherness, of undesirable qualities and or peoples, I don't quote. So how is chocolate also associated with women and or other people or characters considered from lower strata? And what lies behind these associations? Is it humor or perhaps a social commentary?
So yeah, that's a really interesting play. It's actually one of the first pieces that we have that talks about chocolate in Spanish literature. So even though it is written over 100 years after the first sort of encounter with the New World, it's not really written about until the early 1600s, right? And so even though chocolate is already starting to be popular or at least known on the peninsula, we don't have that much mention of it in the literature before then. So these earlier fictional writings tend to disparage chocolate as something connected to this unknown place, right? Even though if we look at other historical documentation, we can find things like letters in the same time period where people complain that there's a scarcity of chocolate or that it's becoming more difficult to procure unless you have strong connections, right? And I think there's also a symbolic nature to the chocolate that's being used in this particular play with that connection to the figure of the Indiano. And if anybody is unsure of what an Indiano is, it's basically that person who went from Spain to the New World in the search for fame and fortune, right? They often came from lower class families or had been seen as kind of having a sort of shady past. And so they were often seen as, problematic when they came back to Spain because they had the potential to disrupt that status quo of the Spanish society. And as you say, some of it was probably also humorous, and we'll talk maybe about a bit more about some of those connections to lower humor in a little bit. But I think it's also a social commentary on the anxieties that Spanish society is facing when they're confronted with this sort of nouveau riche character. We do see even fairly quickly after this that chocolate is starting to become more and more of a status symbol, and people are willing to go to various lengths to obtain and maintain that supply. Much like today, there were various levels of purity, right? We now talk about what percentage of cacao is in a chocolate bar. And then chocolate from different parts of the New World was maybe considered more valuable than others, right? Chocolate from Oaxaca was often considered the more valuable form. And so we start to see characters, and particularly women, female characters in the literature, who will pretend that what they have on hand is that good stuff, right? Or they'll have a little bit, and so they'll send their servants to get some of the lesser valuable chocolate to mix it and extend the life of the better chocolate. And so it does become quite quickly associated with women, right? Women were actually expected to entertain guests who arrived either announced or unannounced at their homes. And part of that was to offer them something, a snack or a drink, right? And chocolate actually quite quickly becomes that expected offering at these social visits. And in fact, we find later on towards the end of the 17th century that there are characters who start to complain that every time they visit a house, and they have to visit several houses a day to do business or whatever they need to do, that they've been given so much chocolate that they're now getting sick of it, right? So there's sort of this quick move to associate that this good from the New World, right, from an other, as in somebody who's not like us, with women. And that is part of a trend that we see throughout this literature, that we want to associate that which is different or that which is other with that which is more familiar, right? And women are also an other, right? They aren't men. So they're seen as sort of unfamiliar in a lot of this literature. And we see that they also are something that Spanish men are somewhat familiar with, or at least know how to deal with. So they move the unknown of the New World and codify it onto women, right? Which then in turn allows them to better understand and assimilate it into their everyday lives. We also see this with some of the indigenous characters when they're portrayed in this literature. And I've argued this elsewhere, that those comparisons, even negative ones, are made between them and Spanish women.
So this is sort of a follow-up. There are also scatological comparisons with chocolate. How is this all interrelated?
Yeah, so that was sort of that lower humor that I alluded to just now, right? So we see these scatological connections often done for this humor, for the laugh, right? In Spanish, there's a homonymic connection between cacao and the word caca, which is sort of this infantile way of talking about poop to kids, right? And so they use that throughout some of these plays, particularly to make sort of what we would call poop jokes today, right? Even the philosopher poet, right, the Calderón de la Barca, uses this lower form of humor in a play. And what's interesting about the literature that I found that uses this scatological connection is that they tend to be much later works, right? The Calderón play is from 1657. And then there's another one that I found, an anonymous interlude from the mid 18th century, which is kind of beyond what we normally consider in our field to be that golden age of Spanish literature in the 16th and 17th centuries. So we would expect by that period that people would be aware of chocolate, would know what cacao is, and yet both of these plays rely on the ignorance of characters to make this association between chocolate and caca. There's other scatological associations that arise, particularly in that mixing of the different chocolates to extend the quantity and quality of the good stuff. So even by the early 1700s, we find characters who complain that they know, right, that they're being offered this lower quality chocolate, and that some of it is being so diluted by unknown ingredients that it's actually acting more as a laxative. And that's really actually a commentary on the value that we place, or that Spaniards placed on their appearances at that time. Women in particular had to know the importance of maintaining a facade, right? Even when the interior is perhaps crumbling. And so serving a good chocolate would keep up appearances of having a solid economic foundation in their home.
So fascinating. So tell us now a little bit about the presumed aphrodisiacal, I can't not say that word very well, I'm sorry, and magical properties of chocolate, and what are the connections between chocolate and witchcraft?
So yeah, the aphrodisiacal connection comes from some of the pre-conquest materials, right? So those materials that existed in the indigenous communities before any kind of encounter between Spain and the New World. And then also from some of the observations of the conquistadors in those first contact moments. So for one, we have codices, which depict the scenes in pictographic form. So many of those include cacao pods or trees, and they tend to be representations of ceremonies in which the pod is given to somebody as part of a ritual, or in one case, as a wedding gift between two deities. And then we have the diaries of several conquistadors that mention seeing Montezuma being offered chocolate as a drink before he is supposedly going to sleep with several of the women in his harem. And the interpretation is that it will give him enough virility and energy to take on this very important task. And then, of course, the magical properties we start to see more and more in the Spanish literature. One of the first pieces that mentions chocolate at all is a dialogue by a person named Bartolomé Maradon, who has three characters: an indigenous person, a doctor, and a bourgeois. Now, the only surviving version that I've been able to see is actually a translation into French, so that bourgeois could have been something different in the original Spanish. But they discuss these effects of tobacco and chocolate on whoever is ingesting them. And it's interesting because in this dialogue, it's actually the indigenous person who suggests that these are evil substances that could hurt somebody who indulges in them, and is then backed up by the doctor in this assessment, right? And it's also this indigenous character who makes the connection between indigenous women, chocolate, Spanish women, and that potential for witchcraft, right? The implication is that indigenous women are involved in witchcraft in some way. And now that chocolate is being presented to Spanish women and they are becoming very fond of it, that they will also end up in that potential to create magic or do witchcraft. We see various instances of chocolate throughout the literature being used to poison someone or put a spell on them. And that actually spills over into real life. The last Habsburg king, Carlos II, Charles II, is assumed to have been poisoned by his mother, right? The rumor was that she had taken the brain matter of a dead person and put it into Carlos's chocolate drink in order to keep him sort of dull-witted. They also say this is why he's unable to impregnate his wife later in life, so that she can continue to act as regent, right? Of course, now we know a lot more about genetics and things like inbreeding. And so that's really what makes his nickname El Hechizado, or the cursed, more applicable. But the idea that chocolate, because it has such a strong taste, could be used as a cover for some of the less interesting ingredients, the more distasteful ingredients being associated with magic and potions, was definitely well known and considered to be a likelihood at the time. And then, of course, we have a really interesting, scathing, satirical work that connects chocolate with magic, which is this anonymous piece called El Gran Sermón, or the Great Sermon, which was presumed to have been written by a Sephardic Jew who was in exile in Holland. And the piece uses chocolate in the place of religion as a colonizing force. So the writer has priests take chocolate to places like Africa and Asia and apply it to miraculously heal and therefore convert some of the leaders of those places, which really is just a facade for demonstrating that religion was as flimsy an excuse as chocolate to take lands away from people violently.
So how do these topics resonate today?
I mean, obviously, we still love chocolate, right? It's still a big part of our lives. I think the biggest connections that I see are the debates over purity, right? Whether it's good for us, whether it's healthy for us. If we mix it with certain things, is it okay? Or should we, be taking in more pure versions of chocolate? So we still have that concern about what we're mixing it with. And that comes up a lot in both the historical documentation and the literature. It's still something that we would consider a gift, right? We think that's quite a nice gift, although maybe we don't expect the same, here's your chocolate when you walk into my home, right? And of course, we're still writing about it. There are books and movies in more recent years like Water for Chocolate or Chocolat, even Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that show that we are still interested in chocolate and that chocolate has sort of a mystical or magical property to it. Right. And actually, when I was writing the book, I was in Spain for some of the research, and I was invited to the wonderful premiere of a new play written in the last 5 years by Julieta Soraya, who's a current playwright and artist in Spain. And that play was called Mestiza. I write about it in the epilogue to the book. This play was based on the life of one of the first mixed race children to be born of a Spanish conquistador and an Incan princess. And in the play, she's sort of ending her life. She's towards the end of her life. But Francisca Pizarro tells a young Tirso de Molina, who's an actual playwright of that time period, about her life growing up in Peru, crossing the Atlantic, and then living out her old age in Madrid. And towards the end of the play, there's this really sweet moment where Tirso gifts her with a bag of cacao beans, which she hasn't seen in a long time. And she's reminded of her childhood and a lullaby that her mother would sing to her. And so in the play, she actually comes down from the stage and moves throughout the audience, handing out these precious beans to audience members and talking about how significant they are and were, not only to her, but Indigenous peoples in general. And it was just a really great moment that made me think more about the connections of the past and present and the legacy of this conquest for both Spain and Latin America. And it's interesting because it was a beautiful play, but it was not necessarily a happy play. The story being told is frequently one of pain, of feeling that not belonging, that being rejected from both sides of her heritage. And it was also being told in a moment in which Spain was being asked to acknowledge some of the atrocities that had been committed during the conquest, which was eventually refused by the King of Spain to comply with this request. So chocolate brings us a lot of joy. It can be related to sort of these big celebrations, to romance, but it does have this darker side, this darker history that extends to today, right? With the exploitation of chocolate producers, even now. So perhaps, we're moving from those religious and medical debates of that moment into some of the debates like climate change and workers' rights that are ongoing today.
Thank you so much. We still have, that was my official last question, although I have more, but I see that at least we have one question from a member of the audience. We have around 15 minutes to have a dialogue. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A tab that you'll see on the button of your Zoom screen. So first, I want to say thank you again, Erin, for this wonderful conversation, and thank you for the audience. I can see that I can recognize many people in the audience, and the first question is from a dear friend, colleague, and mentor of ours, Manuel Delgado, and I'm going to read through so you can answer. It says, "Hello, Erin. When I visited the Monasterio de Piedra in the province of Zaragoza some years ago, I was told that a monk of the monastery who traveled to the Americas brought cocoa to the monastery. And he quotes, here they cooked it for the first time in Europe and started to discover its tasty flavor around the mid-16th century. It is documented that in the 18th century, cocoa was already an important ingredient of the regular diet of the monks and their guests." End of quote. Do you agree with this?
Well, thank you, Manuel, for that question and for being here. It's lovely to not see you, but have you with us at least. Yeah, that's really interesting. I have not heard that story. I know that they're around probably the mid-16th century is when cacao started to be imported back into Spain. And I would say even by like the late 17th century, it's a fairly important ingredient. Like I said, by that point, people expect it to be presented to them when they come to someone's house, right? And so it's still very much the drink. But yeah, I would say that's approximately the right time period.
The next question. Is from Rosanna Mueller. And it says, can you speak about the controversy concerning colonial nuns?
I'm not sure which controversy we mean by that. I don't know if Rosanna wants to perhaps give us a few more details about which one what she's alluding to. And then maybe we can come back to it. And make sure you're using the Q&A because we're not really monitoring the chat, just so everybody knows. Okay, so Rosa has come back and said, yes, so this actually is sorry, Glenda, I'll let you read the whole question maybe.
So it says they use chocolate, but they did, they did it to break their fast. Is that what? Mm-hmm.
So I think what Rosanna is alluding to is a big debate that goes on in the church at the time when chocolate first becomes popular in Spain and in Latin America, and particularly with people like nuns who are involved with the church. And this is actually one of the questions that the Santa Rosa play alludes to as well, which is whether or not you could drink chocolate when you were fasting. Right? You were allowed to have water, of course. You were also allowed to have wine, but you weren't supposed to eat or drink anything that would give you a lot of energy. And so chocolate, when it first comes to Spain and the priests start to see people drinking this regularly, they become quite concerned because they also hear rumors that the indigenous people often would drink chocolate in order to keep themselves going all day, right? It would be their big breakfast, and then they wouldn't have to have another meal because they could work all day just on the energy that a chocolate drink would give them. So the church comes down quite heavily on chocolate at some points, but there is a debate. There are different theologians who go back and forth. So it really comes down to who you asked at the time, whether or not it would break your fast. It is eventually banned in the churches, especially in Toledo. The Archbishop of Toledo says, stop bringing chocolate to church because it was too disruptive. But the fasting debate goes back and forth. And I would really recommend the Santa Rosa del Peru by Agustin Morreto and La Niña Segredo to learn more about that debate, because Santa Rosa is in fact trying to fast to show her devotion to God, and is given this chocolate, and she says it's okay because it's just a little bit and it's not breaking the fast. But you see that back and forth throughout that time period.
I think the next question is by Bruce Brunningham. Hi, Bruce. Thank you for coming. And it says, and it might be maybe related. So hi, Erin, congratulations on your notebook. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but I am looking forward to doing so. Have you by any chance read and perhaps engaged Wolfgang Schiebelbruch's A Taste of Paradise, a social history of spices, stimulants, and intoxicants, in which he has a chapter of the importance of chocolate for early Catholic monarchies, in contrast to the importance of coffee for Protestant countries?
That's I have not actually read that book. It sounds quite interesting, so I'll have to look into that, because in fact, recently somebody asked me about whether or not coffee shows up in this literature at the same time, and it really doesn't, which kind of surprised me and the person that I was talking with, because coffee is such a big deal now in places like Spain and Italy and places that we consider sort of traditional Catholic countries. So I'll have to look into that. Thank you very much, Bruce.
I think we still have around 10 minutes. If anyone else want to pose a question or a comment.
Looks like Laura has a question in the chat. I can read it if you can't find it. It's okay.
Sure, I'm sorry, I cannot see it. Mhm.
She says, Erin, you mentioned the importance of the chocolate's origin. Some chocolate was considered better than others, like the one from Oaxaca being the best. Have you found an explanation or have you reached a conclusion as to why certain regional chocolate was better than that from other regions? That's actually a really interesting question. I don't know why. I don't know why. I know that Oaxaca is seen as like sort of the pinnacle. I don't know if it's because they could get more from there. I have to look into that more. I just know in the literature, you'll see references to like Mis Oaxacas, and it doesn't even say chocolate, and it's just known that that's what they're talking about.
Any more questions? In the meantime, I can, Melissa, hola, thanks for coming. And she mentions, I do not have a question, but I want to let you know how much I am enjoying reading this text. This book is delicious, and I am, yeah. So thank you, Melissa. And then Bruce has a comment, and he says, Schimmelbusch argues that the caffeine in coffee gave rise to the Protestant work ethic. He also notes that Lloyd's of London started out as a coffee house before jettisoning coffee in favor of the insurance business that so many of his clients were involved in.
And I got a private question, asked if I can talk a little bit about how I conducted the research for the book, what archives I explored, if there was material I didn't get to, or what might form the basis of another book. So I spent some time in Spain, both in Madrid at the Biblioteca Nacional, and which is the National Library, and the National Archives there. And then a little bit in Toledo, because that's where some of the religious documents were, especially this rejection by the sort of upper echelons of the church for chocolate being either in the church in general or as a part of the fast. And also in Seville, which is where the Archive of the Indies is, which is where a lot of documentation came from. When they brought things back from the Americas to Spain, that's where it was sort of stored and disseminated from there. And that was really interesting because they even had court cases where people, for example, were trying to get money from somebody that owed them money, but that person didn't have any money. And so they said, well, I know they have a shipment of chocolate coming and that's worth something, so I will take that in lieu of payment. So those were really interesting. If there's anything I didn't get to, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there are things that I did not get to. I am interested sort of in this question of what other goods, like how was coffee introduced? Coffee is in Spain in sort of the early 1600s, but it really doesn't take off the way that chocolate does. And maybe there's something to what, Bruce has been mentioning, this idea of coffee and the caffeine as the Protestant work ethic, where the opposite was true, where they were so concerned that this would give people energy that they wanted to ban it in the Catholic Church. So there's always something else, I'm sure.
We have two more questions. One from Laura. Hola, Laura. Thanks for coming. So thinking of how chocolate was not adequate during certain times has made me wonder, was chocolate not allowed for a specific segment of the population? Was it considered a luxury for certain people?
Yeah, it was certainly a luxury item, particularly at first, right? And there are at least literary sources that talk about, servants would be so excited when they would get just to have a little taste of this. And there's one play in particular, I'll have to look up the name and send it to you, but where the servant is posing as an Indiano to help his master get what he wants to get. And he's just like throwing back cup after cup of chocolate, and people will say like, oh, this is my third cup of the day, I don't want any more. And he'll be like, I'll take yours as well. And so there is definitely this upstairs, downstairs effect of chocolate.
And the next one from Susan Juan de Garcia. Hi, Susan, thank you for joining us. And she's saying, enjoying this conversation so much. Can you talk about the importance of sugar in the popularity of chocolate as a refreshment?
Yeah, I think obviously when it gets to Spain, right, the drink as it's served in the Americas is quite bitter. They don't add a whole lot of sweetening agents to it, but when it gets to Spain, that becomes more and more important. And so obviously there's going to be that sugar chocolate connection, right? In some cases they used honey, they use things like vanilla, especially in the Americas. But yeah, sugar becomes more and more interconnected. And there's, another piece where if somebody wanted to pick up and do, a project on food culture in Spain, I think sugar would be a big one.
I think we have 3 minutes for any comments, additional comments or questions. I do agree with Melissa that reading this book was delicious. I was craving chocolate as I was reading through, and it was just delightful to read it. So congratulations, Eric.
Thank you.
It was just great. And
I would say that would be my big warning. If you decide to take on a food project, you will probably end up eating a lot of the food as you do the research and thinking, maybe I could just have like one more hot chocolate today, right?
Yep, especially with this book. Okay, so we have 2 more minutes. I was wondering if I may ask one more question. If there are any instances when chocolate as a name, because you mentioned in your book that some characters are named Chocolate, especially this is specifically a name given to funny characters, graciosos. Is there any connection with the race, chocolate and race?
That's a really interesting question. There's nothing that I saw that was direct, right? There's no obvious connection. Like they didn't use what Nick Jones has called habla de negros, which is this speech that is slightly modified, that was considered sort of the way that Black people might speak Spanish. But certainly a lot of them are servants coming from the New World. So they could be indigenous, they could be of African descent. And there's also in some of the shorter plays, these sort of what we call entremeses, these interlude plays, there's specifically African descendant characters making the chocolate. So it's that's maybe one of those lines of research that needs to be delved more into.
So that could be a future project for you. Great. Here's one more question. You mentioned sweeteners such as sugar, honey, and vanilla during your research. Was there a particular unique chocolate recipe or preparation that surprised you?
I would say what they were mixing with chocolate is interesting, right? So obviously, like in the Americas, it was usually ground maize, like corn. But when it gets to Spain, they add things like eggs to sort of thicken it up. Really, most of the recipes were fairly simple. Usually just, the chocolate, water, hot water usually, some spices or the sweeteners. And that was it. And it was the less things you put in it, the healthier it was considered, right?
Like nowadays, right? One more, and this might be the last one that we can take. Congratulations on your book. And this one comes from Julia Dominguez. Thank you for this event. I'm curious about the geographical reception of chocolate in Spain. Were there any differences dependent upon the geographical area? If so, how was chocolate appropriated by different groups / territories?
So that's interesting. I would say the places that I most read about would be Madrid, just because it being the court at the time, that's where, a chocolate eventually would get to. Toledo, which is where like the religious authorities really railed against it, and Seville, of course, as being sort of the port where everything came through. Other than the religious authorities sort of being very, pushing back on it quite a bit, the reception was fairly ubiquitous, that it was good and we wanted it. It was more whether or not it was available, right? Lots of boxes of chocolate seem to fall off the backs of ships, perhaps into, the captain's drink for the evening. I don't know, but that seems to be a thing that people complain about a lot, that it goes missing on the journey. But obviously it was a rough journey, and things did go legitimately missing, right?
Great. So we are now at the end of our session. If you have more questions, I'm sure that Erin would be really happy to answer them via email. I wanted to thank again our author, Erin, for this great conversation, and congratulations for this amazing book. Interesting, fascinating, and as Melissa said, it's just delicious to read. So thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, University of Toronto Press, for organizing this. It has been really exciting and interesting to talk to you, Erin.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank you, Glenda. Thank you, Erin. Thank you to everyone who attended. We did put the link to the book page on our website into the chat for people. It's currently 35% off, so very affordable at only $18. So get yourself a copy. And Erin, there are lots of congratulatory messages in the chat. So again, I echo what everyone else is saying. Congratulations on writing a really fascinating book. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. There will be a recording made available after the webinar, so you can look for that in your inbox